Today, the last part of 11.2.5 patch is launching, since we have the uncapping of the gilded crests for you to upgrade your gear, as well as the release of our Dinar vendor for you to buy your best in slot items. So we think that with this new extra change, now we have the full power of your specs, the full power of the specs until the end of this season, which is likely what we will end up having as our, strongest specs benchmark for the final part of this expansion, pending, of course, any further balance from Blizzard. We have had some up and downs in terms of buffs and nerfs since the beginning of this season, so maybe something will change, but given how late we are, 2.5 months into this season, it starts to be a bit unlikely for that to happen. So at this point, we are all familiar with the change in the meta we have been covering, which was the heavy growth of Beastmastery Hunter, making it into the top 3 picks in the meta of Mythic Plus. We're gonna have, of course, also, in case you are curious or want to check it out, in just a couple of days this weekend you will have the group stages of the MDI. So you get to see even more clearly and even more cleanly which kind of compositions groups are going to be running in these very high level keys. We can see now the full spread of the popularity of the specs after 2.5 months, 10 weeks of the season. Tanks and healers we can keep together as they have been very smoothly progressing in the same direction since the beginning. Prot Paladin losing out to Prot Warrior and Resto Shaman losing out to Resto Druid. Still worth pointing out that at the very least both of these picks for both healer and tank are still completely viable. There are still many title range keys being run by the underplayed spec, talking about Prot Paladin and Resto Shaman, so it's not that they lost out to the extent of Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example. Or, for example, in the case of Resto Shaman in Season 3 compared to Discipline, etc., etc., it's way more viable to still play Resto Shaman and to still play Prot Paladin right now. In fact, you can even go in the actual top keys at this second being run in Red.io leaderboards, and look, there's plenty of Resto Shamans still visible. There are still a few Prot Paladins, obviously not nearly as many, but in terms of high keys, you can still see a reasonable amount. Obviously, the biggest difference, as we mentioned, has been in the growth of BM, and then we will talk later also of Elemental, but you can see that the spread of popularity over the entire season is already kind of visible. You already start to kind of see more BM Hunters pop up, and then when you only check the last, for example, couple of resets, you see even more popularity of BM Hunter. And also the other thing we checked out, the fact that the one that was losing out to make space for BM was Arcane. It has truly been interesting to notice the speed at which Arcane lost its spot in this high keys. This was last week, for example, and you see that Arcane had dropped out of the top 6 different comps, and it was still only present in 4 of them. That's how little it had been eliminated from the meta. In fact, it had gotten to the point that now it's gotten boring to look at whether or not Arcane makes it in part of the meta comps, because it has lost so much over time. Now instead it starts to get more juicy to try to look at the growth of Elemental, because given for granted that Frost DK is not really losing its spot, and that BM, of course, is now growing out of control in the meta comp, of course now the eyes are in Elemental and in the current state of Havoc Demon Hunter. Because yes, Mage has lost its spot, but that spot was lost to BM. So why do we still have Elemental in the most run key at plus 21 last week, and also Elemental in the 4th most run comp, and even in the 5th most run comp. And one of these does indeed include replacing Havoc Demon Hunter. In terms of rating, Havoc is still keeping up. You can see that, for example, while Arcane started to lag behind the other top picks, we have Frost Decay, of course, still first, but then you have Havoc as the second one, probably also thanks to having been meta more than the upcoming specs BM and Elemental, especially Elemental being the more niche pick. Even when you look at the completed keys while still being at high level, Elemental is easily the least popular out of these top ones. Same goes by changing ways to track the average rating of the specs. You still have Frost Decay as the very highest one, and then you have the loss of Arcane, which has now fallen behind both Elemental and Havoc, very close to each other in the average results in Mythic Plus. Still though, because of course Havoc was the older spec in the meta and Elemental is the newer spec growing, the result is that when you look at the current higher keys being logged, you will see still overall more Havoc Demon Hunters than you will see Elemental Shamans. Of course, you will still see Elemental Shamans quite often, but you will still see in general way more Havoc Demon Hunters. You will of course see first and foremost the couple now of DKBM, and also you will start seeing the fewer presence of Arcane Mages because they are being purged away from top keys. But of course, when you look at the time here, there are some of these are from 1 day ago or 5 days ago, but then some of these can also start to be from over a week old. And then the lower you go into, for example, depleted plus 21s or time plus 20s, you can start getting into older than a week ago. This is, for example, from 12 days ago. So obviously these results are not, updated day by day, depending on what the meta changes. They can be upwards of 2+ weeks old. So when you look at the shift in the meta in just a couple of weeks, a few of these things can change by a good amount. So I would say what is still cool as we got into the last part of this season, your item level is now fully unlocked. Now you even have your best in slot vendor confirmed, that now you even have the mythic boots from Soul Hunters being part of the vendor for you to buy, for example. So you will be able to get your proper total complete best in slot setup in Mythic Plus. All of the healers will be able to get their hands on a Lumitar trinket in case they didn't have one, for example. It's cool that we do get some alternatives. At this point we are 10 weeks into the season. So if you take the comparison this week, this like 10 week into the season, right? There was no alternative to Disc, there was no alternative to Vengeance, and there was no alternative to Arcane, Balance, Unholy. Now you have 2 alternatives for healers, you have 2 alternatives for tanks, and you have at least 5 options for DPS. Although technically at this point 2 of the options are kind of locked in Frost and BM. You can kind of cycle Elemental, you can cycle Havoc, and you can cycle Arcane Mage right now as part of your DPS composition, which is still better than what we had in previous seasons in this expansion. For tanks and healers, 10 weeks in, we were already deep into Disc domination and complete Paladin domination, with also the enhancement Og Frost Decay combo being the popular pick. So it is pretty good still that 2.5 months into the season we do have on average more options and more variety than what we used to get in this expansion in pretty much all 3 roles. 2 options, 2 possibilities for tanks, 2 possibilities for healers, and at least 5 different picks when it comes to DPS, and this is without counting still multiple kinds of specs able to be right now in title range. I'm talking about Feral, as well as Fury, as well as the Rogues, as well as Red Paladin, which are still somewhat playable, but not nearly, of course, as much as the top specs, kind of like how we had these kind of specs last season. So only talking about the popular enough specs, we do have at least more options this season compared to previous ones this expansion, which is quite good. It's quite good for variety, it's quite good for keeping players into the season for longer, because you obviously have more chances to play your spec. It is good to see at least we're not in a full, complete, total Exodia inflexible season like we had even just going back to season 2 of The War Within, but we could have also gone back to Dragonflight and found multiple other Exodias, very inflexible comps of the same 3 in terms of DPS of the same 3 specs. Now we have more flexibility for the moment. The last of the important points when it comes to Mythic Plus is, of course, as mentioned, the MDI, just to see what top groups and top comps are thinking for their plus 22s, plus 23 keys they will have to do in Mythic Plus. We have already seen the qualifiers of the MDI, the time trials, that gave us, as we said back then, some ideas of the comps they had in mind. This was, over 2 weeks ago, and over 2 weeks ago we already saw BM and Elemental completely overtaking Havoc and Mage. That's why we said 2 weeks ago, when we were still here, the question about the growth of Elemental, and still, of course, the growth of BM Hunter, purely based on what these top groups in Mythic Plus were choosing for the time trials. Now we will get to see what will actually happen in the group stage of the MDI. Maybe something will change. Maybe there has been a full 180. They are going back to playing Arcane Mage or to playing Havoc Demon Hunter. What is almost certain at this point is that if there is one thing that will not change, or maybe 3 things that will not change, is Tank, Healer, and Frost Decay. We have more of an option perhaps in these two picks, perhaps now even less the second one, as we said, being the BM Hunter, but definitely in the third option of the DPS is where you will have more room to choose. But this for today, though, is the recap of how Mythic Plus has been going so far. We have gotten, as we said, a few up and downs in terms of changes and upsets over this season, starting Resto Shaman, only to then have Resto Druid overtake it. We had the 50-50 of Prot Paladin and Prot Warrior ending up being won by Prot Warrior. We started with Arcane Mage as the meta pick, together with Havoc, as well as even Assassination Rogue being quite used early on. We completely lost Assassination, then 2 months later we also started losing Arcane Mage. Now it also does feel like Havoc might start to lose a bit more to Elemental. So we have seen a few upsets in this season of Mythic Plus, way more than what we have gotten used to in terms of changes in the meta throughout the course of a season in previous expansions, or even in the War Within expansion. So for today, on this Wednesday release of 11.2.5 full version, we can now also stop and take a break for now. We have to go and farm our raid again, farm our gilded crests again to cap our item level to 730. So for now, we can leave each other for today. We can start, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know, it feels like I am somewhat in the process of losing my voice for today, especially if I speak any longer.